To the outside world, Clara and Julian were the blueprint of a successful modern marriage. They had met in their late 20s, Clara, an established architect with a pragmatic mind and a generous heart, and Julian, a charismatic entrepreneur whose grand ideas were as captivating as his smile. When they married, Clara felt she hadn't just found a partner, but a teammate for life. Over 7 years, they built a comfortable life in a beautiful suburban home. Clara worked tirelessly, climbing the ranks at her firm, while Julian ran a boutique marketing agency. He was the risk-taker, she was the anchor. Clara had inherited a substantial trust fund from her late parents, which she had carefully invested. Julian knew about the money, but he always praised her financial prudence, insisting that her inheritance was her safety net. "We build our life on what we earn together, Claire," he would say, kissing her forehead after a long day. "Your parents' money is for our retirement, for our peace of mind." Clara believed him completely. She had no reason not to. He was attentive, bringing her coffee in bed every morning and leaving affectionate sticky notes on her bathroom mirror. But behind the charming facade, Julian was building a separate life, one that Clara would end up paying for in more ways than one. In their 8th year of marriage, Julian's demeanor began to shift. The easygoing charm was replaced by a simmering, anxious energy. He started taking late-night phone calls in his home office, pacing the floor with the door firmly shut. When Clara asked what was wrong, he rubbed his temples and sighed, playing the part of a burdened provider. "It's just business, Claire. The market is shifting," he explained one evening over a dinner neither of them was eating. "But there's a buyout opportunity. A tech startup that's about to go public. If my agency can acquire a major stake now, we'll never have to work another day in our lives. We could travel. We could finally buy that villa in Tuscany you're always sketching." Julian laid out the plan over the next few weeks. He had the charts, the projections, and the legal paperwork. He just needed capital. His business was tied up in assets, he claimed, and the banks were moving too slowly. "I hate to even ask," Julian said one night, his voice breaking as he looked down at his hands. "But if we could leverage your trust fund just temporarily, a 6-month bridge loan to my holding company, the return would be exponential." "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't a sure thing." Clara hesitated. Her parents had worked their entire lives for that money. But she looked at her husband, the man who held her when she cried, the man she planned to grow old with, and her love overrode her logic. She signed the transfer papers, authorizing the movement of nearly $800,000 into a joint investment account that Julian managed. She also agreed to take out a second mortgage on their home to provide the remaining liquid cash. He insisted the deal required. Months passed, and the promised return on investment never materialized. Julian became a ghost in his own home. He was always on business trips, flying to Miami or London at a moment's notice. When he was home, he was glued to his phone, shielding the screen from Clara's view. The first crack in the glass appeared on a rainy Tuesday. Julian had left his iPad on the kitchen counter in his rush to catch a flight. Clara bumped it while wiping the counters, waking the screen. A notification sat front and center. Clara's blood ran cold. St. Bart's. Julian had told her he was going to Chicago for a week-long conference. Her hands trembling, she unlocked the iPad using his passcode, his birth year, which she had never bothered to change. What she found made her physically sick. There were hundreds of messages between Julian and a woman named Mia. The texts weren't just romantic, they were domestic. They talked about the future, about a fresh start, and about the luxury items Julian was buying her. There were photos of designer bags, diamond earrings, and screenshots of first-class flight confirmations. What she found made her physically sick. There were hundreds of messages between Julian and a woman named Mia. The texts weren't just romantic, they were domestic. They talked about the future, about a fresh start, and about the luxury items Julian was buying her. There were photos of designer bags, diamond earrings, and screenshots of first-class flight confirmations. But the most devastating message was sent by Julian just 2 days prior. "Don't worry about the funding for the new house, babe. I've almost finished liquidating the last of C's accounts. We are completely clear to launch the new company under your name next week. Panic setting in, Clara immediately opened her laptop. For the past 6 months, she had trusted Julian's verbal updates on their finances. Too busy with her own demanding job to scrutinize the banking portals, she logged into her primary bank. The joint checking account, which usually held their living expenses, was down to $412. She logged into the investment portal where her inheritance had been transferred. The screen loaded, and Clara stopped breathing. Frantically, she called her wealth manager, begging for an explanation. Julian withdrew the remaining funds on Friday, the manager explained gently, confusion lacing his voice. He submitted the dual authorization forms signed by you 3 weeks ago, stating the money was being moved to an offshore corporate entity for the tech acquisition. Didn't he tell you? Clara hung up the phone. She hadn't signed any recent forms. Julian had forged her signature. He hadn't just drained her inheritance. He had maximized the credit line on the second mortgage and emptied their joint savings. He had methodically, legally, and illegally stripped her of everything she owned to fund a new life with another woman. Clara tried to call Julian, her vision blurred with tears of rage and profound grief. It went straight to voicemail. She tracked his phone location through their shared family plan. He wasn't at the airport heading to Chicago. The location pinged at the international terminal, boarding a flight to the Caribbean. He was gone. The realization crashed down on her like a collapsing building. The man she had loved for nearly a decade had spent the last year looking her in the eyes, kissing her, and telling her he loved her, all while meticulously plotting her financial ruin. He had used her deep trust as a weapon against her. She was 35 years old, effectively bankrupt, heavily in debt with a second mortgage she couldn't afford on a single income, and entirely alone. Clara sank to the kitchen floor, surrounded by the beautiful home they had built together, and screamed until her voice gave out. The next few months were a nightmare of lawyers, forensic accountants, and police reports. Because Clara had willingly transferred the initial bulk of the money, the authorities told her it was a civil matter, a complex web of marital assets that would take years to untangle. The forged signature on the final withdrawal gave her a sliver of legal recourse. But Julian had moved the money through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. It was effectively unreachable. Clara lost the house. She had to sell it to cover the massive debts Julian had left in his wake. She moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across the city, packing only her clothes and her architectural drafting tools. There were days she couldn't get out of bed. The financial loss was devastating, but the emotional betrayal was a poison that infected her breath. She questioned every memory, every I love you, wondering if any of it had ever been real. But Clara was an architect. Her entire life had been about understanding foundations, about knowing that even when a structure collapses, the ground beneath remains. You just have to clear the rubble and start again. She threw herself into her work. She took on extra commissions, designing with a fierce, quiet focus. She went to therapy, learning to forgive herself for trusting the man she had married. She realized that Julian's actions were a reflection of his own hollow, sociopathic nature, not a reflection of her intelligence or worth. 3 years later, Clara sat in a small but thriving firm of her own. She wasn't rich anymore, and the legal battles to recoup a fraction of her stolen money were still crawling through international courts. Julian was still out there, living a life built on stolen money and lies. But as Clara looked out the window of her office, drinking a cup of coffee she had bought with money she had earned herself, she felt something Julian could never buy, steal, or forge. She was free. She was standing on a foundation that no one could ever pull out from under her again. Because this time, she had built it entirely by herself. While Clara was rebuilding her life brick by brick in the city, Julian's stolen paradise was beginning to rot from the inside out. At first, life with Mia in the Caribbean was everything he had fantasized about. They lived in a sprawling rental villa, drank champagne on yachts, and posted carefully curated pictures of their glamorous lifestyle on social media, always blocking Clara and anyone connected to his past. Julian had convinced Mia that he was a self-made millionaire, a genius investor who had cashed out at the perfect time. But $1.2 million, the total sum he had managed to extract from Clara's trust and their home's equity, is not infinite, especially not when sustaining a life of reckless luxury. Julian had intended to use the stolen funds to actually launch a new marketing empire offshore, confident in his own brilliance. But Julian's brilliance had always been a facade propped up by Clara's stability and financial backing. Without her sensible advice and the safety net she provided, his business decisions were disastrous. He invested heavily in an unregulated crypto scheme, hoping to double the stolen money quickly to keep Mia accustomed to the lifestyle she expected. Within 80 months, the market crashed. Half of the stolen money evaporated overnight. Mia, who had fallen in love with the wealth rather than the man, began to notice the changes. The private charters turned into commercial flights. The designer shopping sprees stopped. When Julian finally confessed that things were temporarily tight, the illusion shattered. Mia didn't stick around for the rebuild. One morning, Julian woke up to find her gone, along with his Rolex, his laptop, and the remaining cash in their safe. Back in the United States, Clara's forensic accountant, a relentless man named Marcus, had never closed her file. Clara paid him a small retainer every month from her new salary, refusing to let the forged documents go unpunished, even if she never saw a dime of the money again. Julian, desperate and running low on funds, made a critical error. In his panic after Mia left, he attempted to move the remaining offshore funds back into a disguised, US-based account to avoid international banking fees and to try and start a new domestic business under a fake LLC. He used the same laptop, the same IP address, masking software, and the same routing numbers he had used to forge Clara's signature 3 years prior. Marcus's tracking software, which had been monitoring the dormant offshore routing numbers, immediately pinged. He got sloppy, Clara, Marcus said over the phone, his voice vibrating with excitement. He routed the money through a server in New York before bouncing it to Delaware. It's no longer just a murky, offshore marital dispute. He crossed state lines using fraudulent documents. It's federal wire fraud. Clara sat at her drafting desk, her pencil pausing on the blueprint she was drawing. She felt a strange sense of calm. What happens now, Marcus? Now, Marcus said, we hand the IP logs and the wire transfers over to the FBI. Julian was sitting in a cheap motel room in Florida, trying to secure a loan under a falsified name, when the heavy knock echoed on his door. He assumed it was the manager asking for the weekly rent. When he opened the door, he wasn't met with a manager, but with 2 federal agents. The arrest was unceremonious. There were no flashing cameras, no dramatic chases, just the cold, hard reality of handcuffs locking around his wrists. As they read him his rights, Julian's mind raced, trying to formulate a lie, a pitch, a way to market himself out of this situation. But there was no one left to charm. During the interrogations, Julian tried to play the victim. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, that Clara had authorized the transfers, that they were a married couple handling joint assets. But the federal agents placed the IP logs, the forged signature analysis, and the wire fraud documentation on the table. The paper trail was absolute. Faced with up to 20 years in federal prison for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud, Julian's bravado completely evaporated. He took a plea deal, agreeing to surrender all remaining assets and serve 5 to 7 years in a medium security facility. A month after Julian's sentencing, Clara received an envelope in the mail from the Department of Justice. It contained a check for $142,000, the remnants of the money the government had managed to seize from Julian's frozen accounts. It was a fraction of what he had stolen from her. But looking at the piece of paper, Clara realized it didn't matter. She didn't need it to survive anymore. That evening, Clara attended the annual City Architectural Gala. Her firm had been nominated for the Urban Renewal Project of the Year, a community center she had designed for an underprivileged neighborhood, built on the concept of creating light and space in places that had experienced decay. When they called her name as the winner, Clara walked up to the stage in a stunning, emerald green gown. She looked out at the crowd of her peers, her friends, and her new colleagues. They say that a strong foundation is the most important part of any structure. Clara said into the microphone, her voice steady and clear. But I've learned that a foundation isn't made of concrete or steel. It's made of resilience. It's the knowledge that even when everything is stripped away, your mind, your talent, and your integrity belong entirely to you. No one can ever forge that. As the applause washed over her, Clara didn't think about Julian in his cell, or the money she had lost, or the years she had spent grieving a ghost. She thought about the beautiful skyline of the city she was helping to build, and the limitless, unshakable future she had built for herself. 5.5 years after his conviction, the heavy metal doors of the Federal Correctional Facility clanged shut behind Julian. He stood on the side of a desolate highway in an ill-fitting gray suit, holding a clear plastic bag containing his wallet, a prepaid flip phone, and $84. There was no one waiting for him. The years in prison had stripped away his charm. His hair was thinning and entirely gray, his posture stooped from years of sleeping on a thin mattress and keeping his head down. He had spent his sentence trying to hustle other inmates with grand ideas for post-release business ventures. But inside those walls, his smooth words held no currency. Julian walked to the nearest bus stop. As he sat on the splintered wooden bench waiting for the Greyhound to take him to a halfway house in upstate New York, he bought a cheap cup of coffee and picked up a discarded newspaper left on the seat. He flipped through the pages aimlessly until he reached the business and lifestyle section. He froze. Staring back at him was a full-page spread featuring a stunning, modern glass building. In the foreground stood a woman he almost didn't recognize. Clara, her hair was cut shorter, chic and sharp, and the hesitant, eager to please smile she used to wear around him was gone. In its place was a look of absolute, unshakable confidence. The headline read in bold letters, "Architect Clara Hayes redefines the city skyline, from ground zero to industry titan." Julian devoured the article, his hands shaking, spilling coffee on the cheap new. The piece detailed Clara's meteoric rise over the last few years. She hadn't just rebuilt her firm. She had partnered with a global real estate developer man named Elias, whom the article mentioned as her co-founder and fiancé. Elias was described as a quiet, steady philanthropist who preferred to let Clara shine in the spotlight. The article noted that Clara insisted on complete financial transparency in all her corporate dealings, an ethos that had made her firm the most trusted in the country. "I learned the hard way that trust must be earned, verified, and respected," Clara was quoted saying in the interview. "I used to think my worth was tied to what I could provide for others. Now I know my worth is inherent. I build things that last. I don't entertain illusions." Julian stared at the photograph. He looked at the multi-million-dollar building she had designed, the elegant engagement ring on her finger, and the genuine joy in her eyes. He thought about his own reality, the halfway house, his ruined reputation, his criminal record, the fact that he was nearing 50 with absolutely nothing to his name. He pulled out his prepaid phone. For a brief, pathetic second, the old Julian surfaced. He wondered if he could call her. Tell her he was sorry. Tell her he had changed. Maybe ask for a small loan just to get on his feet. He dialed the first 3 digits of her old number. But then, he stopped. Looking at the magazine, Julian finally realized the truth he had been running from for almost a decade. Clara hadn't just survived him, she had transcended him. She was in a stratosphere he could never reach, completely untouchable. To her, he was no longer a heartbreak, a villain, or even a memory worth acknowledging. He was just a hard lesson she had already passed. He deleted the numbers and dropped the phone back into his plastic bag. Thousands of miles away, in a sunlit penthouse overlooking the city she had helped reshape, Clara stood on her balcony. The evening air was crisp. Elias walked up behind her, wrapping a warm blanket around her shoulders and handing her a glass of wine. He didn't say anything, just kissed the top of her head and stood beside her, comfortable in the shared silence. They were equals. They shared everything: their ambitions, their fears, and their bank statements. The gala is tomorrow night, Elias murmured gently. Are you ready for the press? I am, Clara smiled, leaning against him. It's just another building. A beautiful one, but still just concrete and glass. She took a sip of her wine, looking out at the city lights. She knew, vaguely, from her lawyer that Julian's release date was sometime this month. For years, she had dreaded this milestone, wondering if it would trigger the old panic, the old feelings of betrayal. But as the day had approached, she realized she felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no fear, no desire for revenge. The space in her heart and mind that Julian had once violently occupied was now filled with love, purpose, and the deep, profound peace of a life lived off. She had lost all her money to a thief, only to discover that her true wealth was something he could never steal. It was her resilience. Clara turned her back to the city, took Elias's hand, and walked inside her beautiful, secure home. The past was finally, completely, closed.